He was a man of conviction who did not want to be merely an observer, but someone who took action. He provided his people with the means they needed to liberate themselves. He was a strong man who embodied all the beliefs, faiths, callings, and passions of the African American community. A citizen can free themselves not by killing the tyrant, but by no longer obeying the tyrants. For him, a simple incident on a bus in Alabama in 1955 would trigger the meteoric rise of a man who would become a champion in the fight for the freedom of black people and a living symbol of the anti-segregationist cause in the United States. This man was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Taking inspiration from Gandhi, he became a staunch advocate of nonviolence and dedicated his life to improving the living conditions of his black compatriots. For 13 years, he led countless battles and major actions, radically changing the course of history before falling in 1968 to the bullets of a Ku Klux Klan extremist. But to fully understand what happened, let's revisit these events step by step. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, the capital of Georgia, in the southern United States. His father, Michael King, a Baptist pastor, changed his name in the 1930s to Martin Luther King Sr., in honor of the famous 16th-century Protestant reformer Martin Luther. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was the daughter of Daniel Williams, a Baptist pastor at Ebenezer Church and a pioneer in the fight for black rights. Coming from a middle-class background, Martin Luther King had the opportunity to study. He entered Morehouse College in Atlanta at the age of 15, graduating in 1948 with a degree in literature. He then enrolled at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, earning a doctorate in systematic theology in June 1955. In 1952, he met his future wife, Coretta Scott, an organist at the Church of the Brethren. They married on June 18, 1953, and later moved to Montgomery, Alabama, a small town with 50,000 black residents and 80,000 white residents. In 1954, he succeeded his father-in-law as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, a position he held until 1960. He devoted all his energy to addressing the issues faced by the black community in the United States, which had been seeking equality since the mid-19th century. Following the Civil War, the issue of black rights in the South remained unresolved. Despite the Union's victory, the white population refused to integrate black people into community life. In 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee. This segregationist and racist organization advocated for white supremacy and immediately used violence to impose its ideology. White racists and extremists were determined to enforce their laws, even resorting to lynching black people for minor or imagined offenses. In 1871, faced with increasing atrocities and murders, Congress banned the Ku Klux Klan, though it continued its actions in secret. Segregation persisted, particularly in the South, where slavery had lasted the longest. In these regions, segregation was deeply entrenched because whites, who had long been a minority, feared a black takeover. In 1896, a legislative turning point occurred when a Supreme Court ruling legalized segregation. Several laws were enacted to restrict black rights, including voting restrictions such as requiring proof that one's grandfather had voted before 1860, a measure that effectively disenfranchised the entire black population whose ancestors had been enslaved at the time. In 1909, to combat segregation, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, was founded. The movement, based on legal and nonviolent actions, demanded the integration of black people. Martin Luther King would later join this organization. Other, more radical groups emerged, such as the Black Panthers and the Black Muslims, founded in 1930, which included figures like Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. World War II accelerated the integration of black people, particularly in the military, at the request of President Truman, who ordered the military to end segregation. However, by the early 1950s, many states still enforced segregationist policies. A group of 11 states, all former Confederate states from the Civil War, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, along with 2 border states, Missouri and Kentucky, maintained segregation. Segregation governed daily life, from separate restrooms and waiting rooms to assigned seating on public transportation. Schools were also segregated, with black and white students forbidden from attending the same institutions. Hospitals followed the same policy. In 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Martin Luther King first gained national attention. On December 1, 1955, a young black seamstress named Rosa Parks sparked a major protest by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a bus. The driver threatened to call the police if she didn't stand up, to which she calmly replied, "Go ahead." She was immediately arrested and taken to jail. Until then, black passengers would stand and give up their seats to white passengers. But that night, Rosa Parks refused, and her arrest galvanized the black community. In the days following the incident, the inability of a massive boycott of the state's bus company, the entire black community united in support of the movement. Anticipating a long struggle, the NLCP created the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, to encourage mutual aid among black passengers. Naturally, they turned to the new pastor in town, Martin Luther King, to be the movement's spokesperson. Thus, it was not Martin Luther King who chose nonviolence, but nonviolence that chose Martin Luther King. History has shown it was the right choice. The boycott lasted over a year, 382 days in total. Carpool systems, low-cost taxis, and even shoe drives for walkers were organized. The black community's solidarity was unwavering. The struggle intensified, and Martin Luther King was arrested and imprisoned for 15 days. His home, along with those of other activists, was bombed. Several black churches were also targeted, but the fight did not stop. During the campaign, Martin Luther King delivered several impassioned speeches condemning racism. He became a powerful orator, and some of his phrases entered history, such as, "If we are wrong, then God is wrong. If we are wrong, then justice is a lie." His fame grew, and his influence extended beyond Alabama to become national. On November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. It also declared segregation in hospitals and restaurants illegal. The boycott ended in early 1957 when the bus company, on the brink of bankruptcy, abolished the segregated seating system. Martin Luther King had won. He became a prominent political figure and was recognized by the NAACP leadership. The Montgomery incident launched Martin Luther King's career and solidified the civil rights movement. In January 1957, Martin Luther King founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, with a group of pastors, using nonviolent methods to combat segregation. He was named president of the movement and traveled across the United States, delivering over 200 speeches in the following year. He earned the nickname, the New Gandhi. Other battles against segregation followed. On January 24, 1956, 2 young black students were denied enrollment at a school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Despite the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that outlawed school segregation, the governor of Arkansas, supported by a mob of white protesters, mobilized the National Guard to block the students' entry. President Eisenhower, though conflicted, sent federal troops to enforce the law. The students entered the school under military protection. Martin Luther King continued to travel from city to city, offering support through his presence and speeches. On September 20, 1958, after the publication of his book Stride Toward Freedom, Martin Luther King narrowly escaped death during a book signing in Harlem when a woman named Izola Curry stabbed him in the chest. She was deemed mentally unstable, and King publicly forgave her. On February 1, 1960, 4 black college students staged a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, which was reserved for whites. They refused to leave until served. The protest spread, and soon thousands of young black people joined the movement. Sit-ins became a powerful tool of mass protest, mobilizing tens of thousands of people in over 100 cities across the country. Restaurants, cafes, and public spaces were occupied by young activists who used nonviolence as their weapon. Martin Luther King achieved something extraordinary. He not only mobilized, but awakened the consciousness of his black brothers and sisters across the country, inspiring them to take action through nonviolent means. Another method of raising awareness for the civil rights movement was the Freedom Rides, where black and white activists traveled together on integrated buses. On May 4, 1961, the first bus left Washington, D.C., with a group of activists. The journey was marked by violent incidents, including attacks by white mobs and arrests by authorities. On May 13th, the bus arrived in Atlanta, where Martin Luther King greeted the riders. Despite his advice to avoid Alabama, the riders continued, only to be attacked near Anniston, where their bus was firebombed. The Freedom Rides continued, and the courage of the riders inspired the black community. The campaign had two major effects. It exposed the violence of white racists to the nation through television, and it forced the federal government to address the issue. President Kennedy, who took office in 1961, was more supportive of desegregation than his predecessor. The Freedom Rides were a tremendous success. In the months following, the protest movement waned. In December 1961, Martin Luther King arrived in Albany, Georgia, where he attempted to provoke local authorities by organizing demonstrations and sit-ins. However, the police chief, Laurie Pritchett, managed the situation subtly, arresting protesters quietly and dispersing them across multiple jails, weakening the movement's impact. King left Albany and turned his attention to Birmingham, Alabama, where a local pastor sought his help in denouncing police brutality. A protest was organized, which escalated into a violent confrontation. Police used water cannons, tear gas, and attack dogs against the demonstrators. The images of black men, women, and children being brutalized were broadcast nationwide, shocking the world. Over 3,000 protesters were arrested, including Martin Luther King, who wrote his famous Letter from Birmingham Jail during his imprisonment. The letter was a response to criticism from white and black pastors who accused King of inciting violence. He argued that it was not his actions, but the injustice of the system that generated violence. The climate of hatred in Birmingham culminated in a tragedy on September 15, 1963, when 4 black girls were killed in a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church by members of the Ku Klux Klan. The investigation was mishandled, and it wasn't until 2001 that 2 men, Bobby Frank Cherry and Thomas Blanton, were convicted for the crime. In the summer of 1963, Martin Luther King shifted his focus to the North, organizing the March on Washington. The march, supported by President Kennedy, demanded civil rights legislation, a $2 minimum wage, protection for civil rights activists, and an end to police brutality. On August 28, 1963, the march drew nearly 300,000 participants to the Lincoln Memorial. Martin Luther King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, envisioning a nation where people would be judged by their character, not their skin color. The march was a turning point, leading to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, Martin Luther King's dream faced harsh realities. On March 7, 1965, the Selma March was violently halted by police, resulting in 60 injuries. King called for a second march, which was protected by federal troops. By 1965, riots erupted in black ghettos across the country. King's focus shifted to economic inequality, but his efforts in Chicago met with little success. He also spoke out against the Vietnam War, alienating some supporters. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, by a white supremacist. His death sparked nationwide riots, but his legacy endured. He was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. In 1986, Martin Luther King Day became a federal holiday. Martin Luther King's dream of equality and justice continues to inspire. His efforts paved the way for future leaders, including Barack Obama, who became the first black president of the United States in 2009. Through his unwavering commitment to nonviolence and justice, Martin Luther King Jr. left an indelible mark on American history.